Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Horror Mine. My name is Vic Shy, and this is the Scare Score, where I break down horror movies and rate them on how scary I think they are. In this episode, I'll be going over the 2007 South Korean Vietnamese horror film, Muoi, The Legend of a Portrait. The film is pretty historic as it's considered to be the first horror film production in Vietnam. That being said, while the film is mainly shot in Vietnam, it's predominantly a South Korean film surrounding a Vietnamese urban legend. The film tells the story of an author doing research on the urban legend of a cursed painting as the inspiration for her next book. I'll be going over the events that take place throughout the film, while our scare score goes up or down based on how effective the scares are or attempt to be. The first horror film shot in Vietnam was ironically deemed too disturbing for Vietnamese audiences and had to undergo several cuts to obtain the first rating in Vietnamese film history. But how scary is it? Sit back and relax and join me as we explore the urban legend in Muoi, The Legend of a Portrait. Our movie begins in darkness as we hear the creepy sound of a woman humming, followed by an immediate jump scare. The boldness to have a jump scare 30 seconds into the film's opening proves to be effective. The woman humming established a very creepy tone and helped catch me off guard for the jump scare. We see a terrified woman seemingly running away from the creepy humming. She is wearing a red traditional Vietnamese dress called Ao Dai. She retreats into a temple while holding a lantern and gets spooked by her own reflection. Trust me, mine is a lot scarier. Shadow-like fumes emit from the ground below her before she is possibly killed off screen by an unknown entity. We are introduced to our main character Yoon-hee, a South Korean writer doing research on a Vietnamese urban legend. She watches several videos of a man asking locals about the legend, but just like every time I try throwing a party, no one wants to get involved. I knew that lady was blind before she even turned around. She meets with two of her friends, couple Sung-yeon and Ji-hoon, to borrow a camera for her research. They discuss their former friend So-yeon, whom Yoon-hee negatively wrote about in her previous book. So-yeon now lives in Vietnam, and Yoon-hee wants to visit her to get information on the urban legend. The backstory between this group is very messy and gets pretty intense later on. She receives a threatening email from her editor establishing how important this story is for her. She flies over to Vietnam and reunites with her old friend So-yeon, whom she hasn't seen in 3 years. Yoon-hee hardly recognizes her friend, which is odd having been only 3 years since they last saw each other. They get right down to business and start talking about the legend of Muoi. Muoi means 10 in Vietnamese, and she was the 10th child in her family. It is said that Muoi's spirit was haunting her village and was sealed into a portrait by monks. The seal somehow became undone and Muoi's curse began. So-yeon learned about the legend from a professor named Kim who studies Vietnamese folklore. Yoon-hee wants to get in touch with the professor but is told that he went back to Korea and there is no way to contact him. So-yeon asks about her former group of friends, but Yoon-hee lies by saying she's lost touch with them. That night, the pair go to sleep at a hotel. While So-yeon is asleep, Yoon-hee draws up a bath and the shower head starts running on its own. The doorbell rings repeatedly as the shower head turns on once again. She pulls back the curtain to a fairly predictable jump scare. She tries waking up her friend but rudely wakes up the ghost trying to take a nap. So-yeon walks into the room showing that she was never really there. She then nonchalantly mentions that this room just so happens to be haunted. How convenient. They arrive at So-yeon's mansion, which is pretty nice. We don't know what she does for a living, but she seems to be doing very well for herself. She has a private painting area upstairs and asks Yoon-hee not to go up there. Being that this isn't the first horror movie I've ever seen in my life, I know that's not a good sign. The two go on a boat ride together and look at each other pretty intimately. Wait a minute. So-yeon reminisces about their past together and it seems that they were very close to one another. She then reveals the story behind the urban legend of Muoi. Muoi was a lonely Vietnamese woman who fell in love with a man named Nguyen. He began painting her portrait but never finished it. The two fell in love but couldn't be together as Nguyen had a fiancé who came from a wealthy family. The woman spread rumors about Muoi all throughout the village for stealing her lover. In typical Asian horror movie fashion, Muoi is ruthlessly tortured by the man's fiancé. fiancé. Her right ankle is broken, Misery style, and her ring finger is snapped backwards. The woman then splatters Muoi's face with acid, disfiguring her. Completely shattered and unable to face the man she loved with her appearance, Muoi decided to end everything. Now, her vengeful spirit seeks revenge on the 15th day of the first lunar month. This falls around the Vietnamese celebration of Tet, which is the lunar calendar New Year. We first saw her take revenge in the opening shot of the film where the woman who tortured her is seemingly killed off screen. Soyeon is telling Muoi's story from inside of her house where she was tortured and died. Yoonhee starts taking pictures with her camera and a door opens on its own behind her. She walks into the room and sees Muoi's haunting portrait. Muoi's tragic backstory is one we've come to expect from an Asian horror film surrounding a curse and a vengeful ghost. Although most of these ghost stories seem similar to one another, I find that the specific cultural aspects of each country make them unique and terrifying in their own ways. This is precisely why I love Asian horror. Soyeon hands Yoonhee a ton of files on Muoi to keep her busy while she creepily paints in her room. There is definitely something odd about her, but I can't help to think about how beautiful she is. While reviewing the files, the wallpaper behind Yoonhee slowly becomes undone and she quickly covers it up. The next morning, Yoonhee rudely wakes up Soyeon to ask about Professor Kim's whereabouts. They head to the school where he works and we are introduced to his assistant named Eun-jung, who is half Korean and Vietnamese. Yoonhee lies about having the stomach issues that I am regularly plagued with to sneak into Professor Kim's office. She sneaks into his office and hears some odd noises accompanied by Muoi's humming. She then steals the professor's notebook on his research into Muoi's legend. They learn that the seal placed on Muoi's cursed portrait was broken during World War II. Her portrait was kept inside of a temple guarded by Buddhist monks. A Japanese major named Yoshimoto raided the temple and broke the seal to the portrait. He also chopped off the arm of a monk who tried to stop him. No one knows what happened to Major Yoshimoto, but Muoi's portrait is still somewhere in Vietnam. The curse is explained a little bit more, but not much is revealed about it. She says that you can ask Muoi to seek revenge for you and she will do so like it's her own beef. The price to use Muoi as a hired gun is a human body. They visit a man who painted a replica of Muoi's painting. When Soyeon asks him to see it, he looks terrified and initially refuses. However, she tells him that Yoonhee has been cursed and that somehow changes his mind. He shows them the replica of the portrait which has the eyes covered because he could feel Muoi's spirit just by looking at her eyes. Yoonhee tries showing Soyeon the picture of the portrait she took at the house, but the picture isn't there. She accidentally shows the picture of Sungyeon and Jihoon, whom Soyeon has feelings for. This reveals that Yoonhee lied about not being in contact with the two. Soyeon doesn't seem fazed and the two go out for a night of drinking at the club. We meet two of Soyeon's Vietnamese friends and Yoonhee thinks a guy is flirting with her. As it turns out, he actually wants to dance with Soyeon, which brings out the green-eyed monster in her. Yoonhee proceeds to go on a deeper drinking binge than I did last month at Chuck E. Cheese's. The night ends with insults thrown as she calls Soyeon a slut. Yikes. Those feelings definitely did not develop overnight. While trying to fall asleep, Yoonhee hears some creepy noises coming from behind her. The bedroom doors slowly open on their own and she gets spooked by an obnoxiously loud jump scare. She is then lured outside by a little girl running around and giggling. We just got 4 horror movie cliches within the span of a minute. That is both impressive and disappointing. She finds the little girl sitting in a concrete pipe and it turns out to be the younger version of Soyeon. She tucks her head and starts crying before revealing a disfigured face just like Muoi's post-acid trip. She wakes up from the nightmare to Soyeon patting her down with a wet towel. Yoonhee soon realizes that her hands and feet are bound to the bed. This would definitely be my type of scene, minus all the crazy hair chopping and deadly acid. Soyeon pours the acid all over her face and she wakes up screaming from her acid trip. Despite the insults and the nightmares from the previous night, Soyeon appears just fine and is cooking breakfast. However, the murderous implications are definitely still there. They speak about the legend of Muoi and Yoonhee downplays the spirit's motive for wanting revenge. This angers Soyeon, who says that people like her are why the curse exists in the first place. Yoonhee prints out a picture of Muoi's painting and the wallpaper behind her becomes undone once again. She goes around town asking locals about Muoi, but no one seems to know anything. She runs into the old blind lady from the beginning who seems to be trying to warn her. She goes back to speak with Eunjung, who reveals that Soyeon may have lied to her. She claims that she was the one who exposed Professor Kim to the legend of Muoi, not the other way around. Yoonhee goes to speak with Soyeon in her bedroom, and we get a decent scare involving a purple aoyai and feet.
예쁘지?
The pair get all dressed up for a wine party being thrown at the mansion. The party isn't as fun as you'd expect, as there is now high tension between the two friends. Soyeon gets up and walks away in an oddly menacing way. Yoonhee goes inside to dry off and the lights begin to flicker. That basic scare spooked me a lot more than it should have. She wanders the dark house and gets jump scared by the two Vietnamese friends. They surprise her by speaking Korean, but they say that she is the one actually speaking Vietnamese. She then sees Muoi's spirit in her reflection, mimicking Yoonhee's movement, before another jump scare courtesy of the friends. Yoonhee wakes up from her billionth nightmare holding a picture of Muoi. She wanders the house for real this time and sees fumes coming from Soyeon's bedroom. She goes inside and sees footprints burned into the ground leading towards the bed. She lifts up the blanket to make sure Soyeon isn't a ghost and reveals her normal, pretty feet. That sounded a lot creepier than I intended. Eunjung says that Professor Kim hasn't gone back to Korea but is nowhere to be found. She gives Yoonhee access to his house for a small fee. She hops on Professor Kim's computer and watches a video of him interviewing a supposed victim of Muoi's curse. She describes the same symptoms that Yoonhee has been experiencing: the feeling of being watched, hearing a woman humming, and seeing Muoi's reflection in the mirror. This scene could have worked in making the audience more frightened by the curse, but really feels forced instead. Almost an hour into the film and I'm still not quite sure what Muoi's curse actually does and if it's really all that scary to begin with. She goes up to Soyeon's private painting area and sees a ton of paintings with disturbing imagery.
Maybe God made me a painter for people who aren't born yet.
She then sees a well-painted but creepy painting of Soyeon next to the book she wrote 3 years ago. This is the book where Yoonhee wrote terrible rumors about Soyeon that she thought her friend would never read. As it turns out, she did read it and isn't too happy about the things written about her. Yoonhee goes on the defensive and thinks that Soyeon is trying to put a curse on her as revenge. Soyeon says that she just wants her friend to return to Korea safely.
어때? 닮았어?
Yoonhee packs her things and Soyeon wants to speak with her before she goes. She reveals that Jihoon and his friends sexually assaulted her 3 years ago. He and his girlfriend Song Yeon recorded the entire thing, then spread rumors about Soyeon. This is why she left Korea and fled to Vietnam. Yoonhee apologizes for being a bad friend and terrible person for having written rumors about her own friend. Soyeon forgives her and gives her a ring. She tells her that by going to the temple, she will learn more about Muoi's curse. That night, Yoonhee is woken up by Soyeon in extreme pain. Her body starts to contort and she is unable to cry out for help. It's unsure as to what's exactly happening, but it must be related to the curse. Yoonhee enlists the help of Eunjung and they ride to the temple to help Soyeon to possibly end the curse. We get some nice shots of the beautiful Vietnamese countryside, which I absolutely love. They arrive at the temple and see that several other paintings are being kept there. It's unclear whether or not those are cursed, but they are definitely creepy. The spot where Muoi's portrait used to be is now empty. A monk with a fresh edge up walks up and bows to them. They meet with the one-armed monk and more details are revealed about the curse. We learn that Muoi's spirit was haunting the woman who tortured her but did not kill her. She and her fiancé Win sought out the monks for help. Win called out to Muoi's spirit and offered to finish the portrait for her. Still in love with him, Muoi appeared before him in her human form so he could finish the portrait. However, Muoi was blindsided by her former lover as this was a trick to bind her spirit. The monks burst into the house like a SWAT team and sealed her spirit into the portrait. The last thing Muoi saw before being sealed away was Win holding his fiancé in his arms. Ouch. The monk tells Yoonhee that Soyeon is possessed by Muoi. He hands her a metal pin and says that Yoonhee must stab Soyeon in the heart to end the curse. Eunjung still doesn't believe in the curse and wants nothing to do with it. She tells her to forget about the book and to go back to Korea. She tries to write off, but we all know what happens to non-believers. Muoi's influence possesses a woman to walk out into the street, causing Eunjung to fall off her motorcycle. Her scarf gets caught in the wheel and chokes her to death.
You just gotta believe!
The scarf was ironically the one given to her by Yoon-hee. Yoon-hee returns to the house, weapon in hand, ready to confront So-yeon. The lights go out, setting the perfectly dark setting for this final showdown. The wallpaper becomes undone again, but this time, she peels it back, revealing a hidden door. She opens the door, revealing Professor Kim's dead body melted by acid. She finds a picture of Major Yoshimoto on him with the caption, "Death begins the curse." She enters a dark corridor, flashlight in hand, giving this scene huge survival horror video game vibes, of which I do plan on uploading gameplays of on this channel, by the way, so stay tuned for those. We hear the distorted voice of a man, which sounds really unsettling. She finds an old tape recorder with a voice recording from Professor Kim. It is revealed that the mansion actually belongs to Major Yoshimoto and is where the real portrait of Muoi has been kept all along. Professor Kim tried to stop the curse but died in the process. In a scene reminiscent of the Evil Dead series, Professor Kim's recording starts to chant to summon Muoi's spirit. Yoon-hee then sees Muoi's real terrifying portrait right in front of her. She is shocked to find out that the ring in the portrait is the same one that So-yeon placed on her hand. Muoi's spirit finally appears and begins chasing after her. This scare scene was extremely well done and effective. From the recording of Professor Kim's voice chanting, the reveal of Muoi's real painting, and Muoi's spirit finally showing herself, all worked really well together and scared the crap out of me. Muoi's ghost is attached to the rope she died with, which makes her a lot more terrifying. Yoon-hee tries making a run for it, but her shoes get melted onto the acidic ground. She reaches for the metal pen to defend herself, but Muoi's spirit suddenly disappears. She turns around and sees So-yeon standing underneath the noose. She says that one of them must die and tells Yoon-hee to stab her. She can't bring herself to stab her childhood friend, but manages to do so after getting jump scared into it. So-yeon starts laughing diabolically and says that her death will begin the curse. Muoi's ghostly hands wrap around Yoon-hee's neck and lift her off the ground. With everything having gone according to plan, So-yeon falls back and dies as Yoon-hee is consumed by Muoi's spirit. The edge-up monk tells the old one-armed monk that Muoi's portrait has returned. However, it is actually the portrait of So-yeon sealed within, having taken Muoi's place so she could be released. Yoon-hee is now back in Korea, possessed by the spirit of Muoi. She receives a call from Sung-yeon and eerily says that they will meet soon enough. Sometime later, Ji-hoon's friends head into a bathroom where they hid the video camera containing So-yeon's assault. The possessed Yoon-hee arrives and kills them all in brutal fashion. So-yeon's plan now becomes crystal clear. She got Yoon-hee interested in the legend of Muoi, knowing she would come to Vietnam and investigate. She then manipulated her former friend into unleashing Muoi's curse so that she could exact revenge on those who wronged her. Sung-yeon reviews the pictures that Yoon-hee took on her camera. Her computer shuts off and she hears the noise of a man struggling. A girl can be heard crying from behind her as Muoi's silhouette can be seen walking toward her. Muoi's face briefly appears on the computer screen for an effective jump scare that reminded me of that maze game that would have Reagan's face from The Exorcist pop up once you completed it. Muoi's rope appears in front of her as her ghostly hands wrap around her neck and kill her off screen. She wastes no time in killing her final victim, Ji-hoon. He is thrown around all over the place before being hung. In the film's final scene, the possessed Yoon-hee burns the photo of Major Yoshimoto. Having exacted revenge for So-yeon like it was her own personal grudge, the possessed Yoon-hee puts on Muoi's ring and smiles at the screen satisfied as the movie ends. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Muoi, the Legend of a Portrait. My friends, this movie started out and remained very slow until the third act. While that's not always necessarily a bad thing, I feel that this film could have picked up the pace and scare factor throughout the film. However, the third act really ramps up the scare department and more than makes up for the slow beginning, earning Muoi, the Legend of a Portrait, a fair scare score of 54%. The scariest scene in the film was the revelation of Muoi's real painting as Professor Kim's voice recording chanted out to summon Muoi's spirit. This was a very well done scare scene that combined several strong elements of horror and put a big smile on my face. But, as always, I hope you all enjoyed the video. Thank you all for tuning in, and I cannot wait to see y'all right back here in the horror mine. Y'all stick around.